What if I told you that what's coming is worse than a recession? This is no exaggeration. It's a raw analysis of a reality many prefer to ignore. What's at stake isn't just the economy. It's the stability of a system that has dominated the world for over a century. Today, you will understand why the U.S. economic model is collapsing from within, what signs are already visible, and what this means for you, for your future, and for the future of the global order. My name is Mr. Mani, and I've been studying economic cycles for decades, and what I'm seeing now is unlike anything I've witnessed before. If you want to see what's being hidden, subscribe to the channel now, turn on notifications, and get ready. Because in the next several minutes, we're going to dismantle the myth of American invincibility together. The beginning of the downfall, the crisis of American capitalism. Throughout history, economic systems rise, evolve, and collapse. But rarely does that collapse happen in plain sight, unless you're willing to look beyond the surface. And that is exactly what's happening to American capitalism. For decades, the United States was seen as the ultimate symbol of economic success. Continuous growth, technological innovation, high standards of consumption, global influence. But this image was built on a foundation that began cracking silently and is now buckling under its own weight. The system that once promised progress for all has turned into a machine for wealth concentration, social exclusion, and institutional decay. The promise of the American dream has become a nightmare for millions burdened by insurmountable debt, stagnant wages, and an uncertain future. But this crisis didn't begin yesterday. It's the result of decades of decisions, policies that favored the few at the expense of the many, and a logic that turns everything, even people, into commodities. What we're seeing now is simply the natural consequence of a model that didn't or wouldn't adapt. Worse still, as the problems mount, those in power continue to deny reality. They create narratives, manipulate statistics, and blame external enemies, all to avoid facing an uncomfortable truth. American capitalism is in deep crisis. And this is not a temporary crisis. It's not a market correction, not a normal fluctuation in the economic cycle. It's structural. It's existential. And those who fail to grasp that now will pay a much higher price later. But why do so many still believe everything is fine? Why is it so hard to accept that a system that once worked might now be failing? The answer lies in something deeply human and deeply dangerous: denial. The collective illusion, the age of denial. Denial is an ancient defense mechanism. When fear comes knocking, many prefer to close their eyes, like a child covering their face, and hoping the danger will disappear. That's exactly what's happening in the United States. An entire nation running from a truth that becomes more obvious by the day. This denial doesn't come only from the general public. It's encouraged by political, cultural, and economic leaders. It's easier to preserve the myth of prosperity than to admit the system is failing. It's more convenient to say things will get better than to confront the steep cost of a model that no longer delivers. But denial comes at a cost. It paralyzes. It silences debate. It reduces urgent warnings to background noise. And so, collapse deepens while society pretends everything is normal. We deny inequality. We deny the erosion of labor conditions. We deny the visible signs of institutional, moral, and economic decay. And the more we deny, the harder it becomes to respond. After all, how can you fix something you refuse to acknowledge is broken? And this refusal isn't new. Other empires in the past also clung to the illusion of eternal dominance until the inevitable arrived. Which brings us to the next key point in understanding the present: the cycles of history. Lessons from history. The cycle of empires. Human history is a constant cycle of rise and fall. Greeks, Romans, Persians, Ottomans, British, all believed, at some point, that their dominance would last forever, and all of them fell. Collapse never comes suddenly. It comes in waves. First, stagnation disguised as stability. Then, recurring crises that seem isolated. Finally, systemic breakdowns that make it impossible to sustain the illusion. The British Empire, for instance, took centuries to build, and less than half a century to collapse. Its unraveling didn't begin with war or dramatic explosions, but with economic signals, political fatigue, and a gradual loss of global influence. At its peak, no one imagined it would end, but it did. And the United States is following the same script. The 20th century was its peak, but the 21st century reveals, decade by decade, ever-deepening cracks, lost wars, financial crises, social breakdown, declining international credibility. The notion of American exceptionalism, the belief that the U.S. is somehow different from every empire that came before, is, in fact, part of the problem. It fuels denial. But history is clear. No empire survives once its foundations begin to rot from within. And if there's a clear sign of rot, it's found in the obscene levels of inequality that now define the American system. Concentrated power. The rise of inequality. Over the last 4 decades, the United States has undergone a silent but devastating transformation. A country once promising opportunity for all has become a stage where unimaginable wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority struggles to survive. From 1980 to today, most of the income and wealth generated has flowed to the top. The richest 1% have accumulated vast fortunes, while the rest have seen their earnings stagnate or shrink. This wasn't a natural process. It was planned, orchestrated, and executed through tax reforms, deregulation, and public policies that shifted power from workers to capitalists. Corporations pay fewer and fewer taxes. Billionaires exploit legal loopholes to keep their wealth untouched. Meanwhile, the middle class bears the cost. Skyrocketing healthcare, unaffordable education, housing out of reach. The system that once enabled upward mobility has become a trap of stagnation. If you're born poor, your chances of climbing the ladder are slim. And if you're born middle class, your risk of falling down is greater than your chance of moving up. This inequality goes beyond economics. It shows up in access to health care, life expectancy, safety, education quality. And more than that, it erodes social trust, fuels political hatred, and destroys the sense of belonging. When a few have everything and the many have nearly nothing, the social fabric tears apart. And a country like that is unsustainable, economically, morally, or otherwise. But this inequality didn't emerge from thin air. It accelerated precisely when real wages stopped growing. And that's what we need to understand now. When workers stopped being rewarded, the whole structure began to collapse. The broken ladder, stagnant wages. For 100 years, from 1870 to 1970, real wages in the United States rose consistently. Decade after decade, workers earned more and could afford more. It was a virtuous cycle. Productivity increased, profits grew, and part of that wealth was shared with those generating real value in the economy. This phenomenon helped solidify the so-called American dream. Buying a home, supporting a family with a single job, taking vacations, owning a car, and retiring with dignity. All of this was not only possible, but expected. But then came the turning point. Starting in the 1970s, that seemingly eternal cycle broke. Real wages, that is, the workers' purchasing power adjusted for inflation, stopped growing, and they never meaningfully increased again. In other words, the average American today earns, in real terms, the same as in 1978. Meanwhile, the costs of healthcare, education, housing, and transportation skyrocketed. The most perverse part? Productivity kept rising. Workers are producing more than ever, fueling record corporate profits. Yet this wealth isn't shared, it's extracted. This rupture didn't just lead to economic frustration, it led to hopelessness. The promise that if you work hard, you'll have a better life stopped being true. And that corrodes the bond between the citizen and the system. But the collapse of household income didn't stop there. To try to maintain their standard of living and keep their homes afloat, Americans had to resort to a new resource: mass female labor. And that brings us to the next major transformation, a direct consequence of wage stagnation. Women on the front lines of crisis. When wages stagnated, American families faced a brutal choice: drastically lower their standard of living or find another source of income. The answer was immediate. Women began entering the workforce en masse, not for liberation, as some narratives tried to romanticize, but out of necessity. Previously, in many households, one man's income was enough to support the family. But starting in the 1970s, that was no longer sufficient. The economy now demanded two incomes just to maintain the basics. Women who had once managed the home and raised the children were now working full-time, while still bearing the brunt of domestic responsibilities in the evenings. The emotional and psychological toll was devastating. Constant pressure led to a rise in antidepressant use, growing divorce rates, and overwhelmed households. The emotional pillar of many families, often upheld by the maternal figure, began to collapse alongside the system that forced her into the labor market without offering any real support. And even with this collective effort from families, it still wasn't enough. More money was needed, more consumption, more credit. And that's where the next piece of the economic puzzle comes in: the rise of the debt culture, the new currency, cards, debt, and illusion. With stagnant wages and both adults in the household working, the math still didn't add up. But there was a seemingly simple, quick, and accessible solution: credit. In the 1970s, U.S. banks, once reluctant to lend for consumer purposes, changed their stance. What had once been a luxury for the wealthy, like American Express cards, began being mass-distributed to the public. The era of financed consumption was born. Credit cards, personal loans, car financing, easy mortgages, student loans, all packaged with promises of convenience, progress, and status. But in practice, workers began financing their own impoverishment. Instead of raising wages or revisiting the economic model, the system pushed Americans into debt. And so, the illusion of prosperity was maintained for a few more decades at the cost of a growing, invisible liability. Today, the average American carries debt on multiple fronts: credit cards, mortgages, auto loans, education. Credit dependency has become so embedded that maintaining a middle-class lifestyle is impossible without it. The worst part? This became normalized. A standard lifestyle now includes unpayable debt, and defaulting has become routine, not exceptional. What was once an emergency tool has become the foundation of financial life for millions. Debt replaced wages, credit replaced progress. But this model, artificially sustained by loans, pushed families to the limit. And when you pressure a structure too much without providing support, it breaks. That's exactly what began to happen to the emotional and functional foundation of American society: the family, families in collapse, the emotions of the end of the month. What happens when two people work full-time, raise kids, battle traffic, juggle late bills and growing debt, and still can't breathe? The family structure begins to crack. American families have been pushed into a state of continuous exhaustion. Husbands and wives return home drained, emotionally depleted, with no time or energy to connect with their children, or with each other. The home, which should be a refuge, becomes yet another source of stress. The result? A surge in divorce rates, an increase in the use of psychotropic medication, especially among women, anxiety crises in children and teens, and a generalized sense of disconnection. The system that once promised, "Work hard and everything will be fine," has broken the emotional backbone of American society. Overwork, the weight of debt, and the frustration of unmet expectations, all of it was dumped inside the home. And what should have been a place of support became a silent battlefield. This family implosion isn't a side effect. It's a core symptom of a model that demands everything and gives almost nothing back. And when the family collapses, the next step is inevitable. The financial system begins to crumble too. And that's exactly what exploded in 2008. The Great Shock, the 2008 crisis, the bubble burst, and with it, collapsed the fantasy that infinite credit could replace real growth. For decades, banks profited from the expansion of debt, offering easy credit to finance homes, cars, credit cards, and college degrees. But at some point, the bill always comes due. In 2008, millions of delinquent families could no longer pay their mortgages. And because the financial system had bundled those debts into speculative investments, the default of a single family in Ohio triggered a domino effect in Wall Street, London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo. The world watched in shock as Lehman Brothers collapsed. Major institutions fell, global credit froze, and an uncomfortable truth was revealed. The economic growth of recent decades was a bubble disguised by debt. The government rushed to save banks and corporations, but the families who lost their homes, jobs, and dignity were left with the wreckage. The 2008 crisis wasn't just a financial collapse. It was the moment the system showed its true face: privatized profits, socialized losses. And even after that trauma, nothing structural was fixed. The same model that broke the world stayed in place. Meanwhile, another contradiction was growing in the background. Productivity was exploding, and wages were still frozen. Productivity versus reward, the inverted logic. In a fair world, those who produce more should earn more. But in modern capitalism, that logic has been completely reversed. Since the 1980s, American workers have become increasingly productive. With advances in technology, automation, the internet, and artificial intelligence, the value generated per hour of labor has skyrocketed. Yet, wages haven't kept up. While corporate profits hit record highs, the compensation of most workers remained stagnant. Here lies the paradox. Productivity, what the worker delivers, goes up. Wages, what the worker receives, stay the same. The gap between these two forces was captured by a minority, the owners of capital. The business elite took the bonus. The worker was left with the burden. The result? A system that rewards the top and punishes the base, even when the base works harder and delivers more. This disconnect between contribution and reward is one of the main drivers of modern inequality. It kills motivation, erodes merit, and turns the workplace into a zone of exploitation. And still, the working class kept going. Even without earning more, they continued holding the country up. But the system shows no mercy for weakness. When the pandemic hit, followed by inflation and rising interest rates, the burden became unbearable. Three recent blows: pandemic, inflation, and interest rates. If the working class had already been bleeding for decades, the past few years delivered a series of fatal blows. The COVID-19 pandemic, the inflation explosion, and the historic spike in interest rates pushed millions of families to the brink of total collapse. The first blow came with the pandemic. While CEOs held remote meetings from mansions and shareholders protected their profits with government aid, millions of workers lost their jobs overnight. Many others were forced to keep working, exposed, unprotected, and often without recognition or support. Just as the world began to recover, inflation hit. The cost of living soared. Food, energy, rent, transportation, everything got more expensive. But wages stayed the same. To fight inflation, the government responded by raising interest rates, and with that came the third blow: a brutal rise in the cost of credit. That credit card that used to cover groceries became a trap. That monthly mortgage payment became unaffordable. And student loans, already suffocating, became a lifelong burden. In short, first, you lost your job or had your income reduced. Then, you had to pay more for everything. And finally, you had to pay even more just to go into debt. This chain of shocks wasn't neutral. It had a clear target: the poorest, the most vulnerable, those already on the edge. The American working class was hit from three sides at once, and yet, they're still expected to keep the system running. But when an entire population suffers that kind of economic violence, the consequences become unpredictable. And history shows us what can happen. Just look at what happened in Germany 100 years ago. Echo from the past. The warning of pre-Hitler Germany. When a society is pushed beyond its limit, it doesn't respond with balance. It responds with desperation. That's what happened in Germany after World War I. The country, defeated and humiliated, plunged into a devastating economic crisis. Hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and social collapse created an atmosphere of collective pain, frustration, and disorientation. Between 1918 and 1923, the German currency devalued to the point where it was more useful for lighting fires than for buying bread. Families lost generational savings in a matter of weeks. The dream of progress became a cruel joke. And it was in this ruined landscape that a savior emerged: Adolf Hitler. A man with simple answers to complex problems. A leader who pointed fingers, promised redemption, and offered a new national pride at the cost of reason and democracy. The lesson is clear. When the working class is economically crushed, it becomes fertile ground for extremism. And today, in the United States, we're seeing dangerous echoes of that same pattern. Millions of people living in constant crisis, widespread distrust in institutions, rising polarization, hatred, and the search for scapegoats. The rise of radical rhetoric from all sides. Ignoring this parallel is playing with fate. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but, as Mark Twain once said, it rhymes. And if we want to avoid the same mistakes of the past, we must recognize the signs now. Because while the US tries to hold on to its imperial position, another power is rising, with strength, focus, and strategy. And it's not copying the American model, it's replacing it. The dollar loses the throne. For decades, the world revolved around the dollar. After World War II, the US dollar became the pillar of international trade, global reserves, and financial transactions between nations. To hold dollars was synonymous with stability and trust. But that reign is coming to an end. Gradually, many nations are moving away from dollar dependence. China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others are signing bilateral agreements to trade in their own currencies, no longer in dollars. This quiet yet steady movement represents a direct threat to American hegemony. The war in Ukraine accelerated this process. When countries witnessed the US freezing foreign reserves and imposing financial sanctions, the message was clear. If we disagree with the Americans, they can block our assets. The response? Build alternatives. And one of those alternatives has a name: the Chinese yuan. If the dollar ceases to be the dominant currency, the US will lose one of its greatest privileges: the ability to print money without severe consequences. This would directly impact the cost of living, global investments, and America's bargaining power. In other words, the empire is losing its main tool of control. Which brings us to the inevitable question: who is ready to take the throne? The answer is clear, and it's already on its way. China, the new empire in the making. While the United States faces stagnation, debt, and internal division, China continues to grow, with focus, discipline, and long-term strategy. Over the past 3 decades, China's economy has risen from underdevelopment to become the world's second-largest power, directly rivaling the U.S. on multiple fronts. While U.S. GDP grows on average 2% per year, China grew for decades between 6% and 9% annually. This enabled the country to build massive infrastructure, modernize its cities, expand its tech base, and conquer markets across all continents. China doesn't just manufacture, it innovates. It leads in areas such as artificial intelligence, telecommunications, renewable energy, and even social media, like TikTok. And unlike the US, which often imposes sanctions and military threats, China advances through economic diplomacy and multilateral agreements. The Belt and Road Initiative, for example, connects dozens of countries with infrastructure, transportation, and technology investments, all funded by the Chinese government, which understands the power of economic influence. And what many Americans refuse to admit is something the world is already recognizing. China is no longer just the factory of the world. It is becoming the economic and geopolitical center of the 21st century. Not by chance, countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and even traditional U.S. allies are drawing closer to Beijing. The imperial logic has shifted. Now, leadership doesn't belong to the one who shouts loudest, but to the one who delivers the most results. And while China builds its empire with solid blocks, the U.S. clings to outdated strategies: wars, sanctions, and retaliation. But does that still work? Russia and China. The real war isn't in Ukraine. The conflict in Ukraine is tragic, but those who only see the Ukrainian territory miss the bigger picture. This war is a chapter in the struggle between empires. Russia, despite its internal issues, is China's main military and strategic ally. Confronting Moscow, therefore, is also an indirect attempt by the U.S. and its allies to weaken China's rise. When the West imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, the stated goal was to destabilize its economy. But that didn't go as planned. The ruble didn't collapse. Russia's economy adapted, and, for a simple reason, China and India began buying even more Russian oil and gas, offsetting the losses from the West. This reshaping of global alliances shows that the world no longer revolves around American interests. The attempt to isolate Russia, in practice, accelerated the formation of a new geopolitical bloc, more resilient and less dependent on the U.S. And behind it all lies the true motivation: contain China's rise, weaken its allies, prevent the shift of global power from Washington to Beijing. The war in Ukraine, therefore, is also a backstage war, a battle between a declining empire and a rising one. And denying this reality creates a dangerous illusion that the world can still be controlled with the same tools from the last century. But China isn't just surviving. It's watching, calculating, preparing. And in the meantime, U.S. sanctions, once capable of paralyzing entire nations, now show their limits. The failure of sanctions and the new global alliance. For decades, economic sanctions were America's weapon of choice. If a country went against Washington's interests, it would face blockades, trade restrictions, or frozen assets. But that instrument of power is losing its strength. Russia is a key example. When the war in Ukraine began, the U.S. government promised the mother of all sanctions. It was expected that the ruble would turn to dust, the Russian financial system would collapse, and the population would push for internal change. None of that happened. Russia adapted. It redirected its oil and gas exports to China, India, Turkey, and even Middle Eastern countries. It strengthened ties with emerging powers and became part of a new alliance that no longer depends on the dollar or the Western banking system. And this is not limited to Russia. Countries like Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and even historical U.S. allies are aligning with this new, informal but increasingly solid, global alliance. The logic is simple. If the current system can be used against you, it's better to build a new system. And that's exactly what's happening. The world is reorganizing, and as the US insists on using the same old tactics, it is accelerating its own isolation. Sanctions, once a symbol of strength, now reveal weakness, because they only work when everyone accepts the same authority. But global American authority is no longer unanimous, and as the world changes direction, the US continues to act as if nothing is happening. American isolation. The world moves on without the US. For much of the 20th century, the United States was the world's center of gravity. Everything, from politics to trade, from culture to security, passed directly or indirectly through Washington. But that is changing, and perhaps the most concerning part is that Americans haven't realized it yet. Decisions once followed almost automatically by US allies are now met with skepticism or resistance. UN votes on the war in Ukraine revealed that many countries abstained or voted against American interests. Former allies are signing deals with China and Russia. American cultural influence is being replaced by regional alternatives. The world is learning to move on without the US, and in many cases, to avoid depending on it. This isolation isn't formal. It's subtle, but growing. And it doesn't come from an external boycott. It comes from within, from the insistence on outdated policies, the refusal to adapt, and the arrogance of believing that global leadership is a guaranteed right, not something earned daily. Meanwhile, the world moves forward. New routes, new alliances, new centers of influence. And the US is increasingly becoming just another country on the map. The internal war, crime, and polarization. When an empire starts to collapse externally, the first signs often appear internally. In the US, the collapse is not just economic or geopolitical, it is also social. The country is facing an invisible war, fought in the streets, in homes, on social media, and at the ballot box. Crime is rising, hatred is spreading, polarization is deepening. Ordinary citizens are turning into political enemies. Trust in institutions is plummeting. Conspiracy theories are becoming truths shared in groups and forums. But this doesn't happen by accident. When people lose hope in the future, they look for someone to blame. And then come the scapegoats. Immigrants, minorities, journalists, teachers, neighbors with different opinions. Symbolic violence gives way to real violence. School shootings, armed clashes during protests, an armed, divided nation emotionally on edge. This fragmentation is the most alarming symptom of all. It's not just the empire that's in crisis. It's the idea of community that's falling apart. And when a people begin to turn on one another, the system benefits. Because while those at the bottom fight each other, those at the top continue to accumulate power. But among the youth, something different is starting to emerge. A quiet refusal to accept this model. A youth without a future. The generation that gave up. In university halls, on social media, in online forums, a growing sentiment is uniting millions of young Americans. The conviction that the current system wasn't made for them. This new generation grew up hearing the same promises that shaped their parents and grandparents. Study hard, go to college, work hard, save money, and one day you'll have a stable life. But reality shattered that script. Today, degrees come with crushing debt. Jobs offer low wages, instability, and no benefit. Homeownership is a distant dream, and free time has become a rare luxury. It's no surprise, then, that recent surveys reveal something surprising. The majority of young Americans under 35 prefer socialism to capitalism. And it's not because they deeply understand socialism, but because they feel firsthand that today's capitalism has abandoned them. They see a world where billionaires amass absurd wealth while they can't even afford rent. They witness environmental destruction, endless wars, and recurring financial crises, and realize they are not invited to the future. This disbelief isn't apathy, it's resistance. They don't want to follow the same path as those who now run the system. They want alternatives, even if they're not yet sure what those alternatives are. And if history teaches us anything, it's that when the youth lose faith in the future, the system loses its capacity to renew itself. This new generation doesn't want to burn everything down, but they want something that makes sense, something that offers dignity, purpose, and hope. And while they wonder what to build, the older generations keep repeating the same mistakes. The myth of American military supremacy. For decades, the image of the United States as a world power was sustained not only by its economy, but also by its military might. Bases spread around the globe, aircraft carriers in every ocean, trillion-dollar defense budgets. The message was clear: if you don't obey American leadership, there will be consequences. But the reality tells a different story. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. has been involved in, and lost, a series of strategic conflicts. Korea, inconclusive result, permanent division. Vietnam, humiliating defeat, chaotic withdrawal. Iraq, failed occupation, emergence of new enemies. Afghanistan, 20 years of war to return power to the Taliban. These defeats weren't just military, they were symbolic. They proved that not every conflict can be won with brute force, and that military power has limits when not backed by legitimacy and clear purpose. Meanwhile, China advances without firing a single shot. It conquers markets, invests in global infrastructure, expands its influence through agreements, not invasions. American military supremacy has become a kind of geopolitical theater. Expensive, noisy, but ineffective. And worse, every failure further weakens its external credibility and feeds internal disillusionment. Millions of Americans are asking, what is this military power for if it doesn't protect our jobs, our schools, our healthcare? The answer is painful. It serves to uphold an empire that no longer works. And while the focus remains on weapons and intervention, the country keeps piling up debt, including to those who now challenge its leadership. The invisible thread: debt to China. If war is the visible face of imperial conflict, debt is the invisible thread that ties the defeated to the victors. Today, the United States owes over $800 billion to China. That means that every year, a portion of taxes paid by American workers is sent directly to Beijing in the form of interest payments. That money doesn't go back into schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. It crosses the ocean and helps fund China's economic, technological, and military expansion, America's main geopolitical rival. It's as if the declining empire is, ironically, funding the empire that's set to replace it. This economic dependence is rarely discussed openly, but it reveals a strategic collapse. The U.S. lost the ability to sustain itself through its own production and became dependent on its adversaries to keep functioning. There are no tanks or missiles in this scenario, only numbers, contracts, and wire transfers. But the impact is just as deep as any invasion. And if the American people truly understood this reality, they might question the real cost of maintaining this failed empire. Because the empire didn't fall all at once. It slowly unraveled, receipt by receipt. The last hope. The power of the working class. In the face of all this, economic collapse, social crisis, political decay, and global isolation, the inevitable question arises. Who can change this reality? Not the billionaires. They're profiting from the ruin. Not the traditional politicians. Many of them helped build this system. Nor the major corporations. They are, in large part, the architects of this inequality. The only force capable of transforming this reality is the one that holds it all together: the working class. They are the employees, public servants, delivery drivers, nurses, teachers, factory workers, technicians, drivers, those who build, clean, care for, operate, and keep the country running every day. They are the soldiers who fuel the system. They are the taxpayers who fund the government. They are the consumers who keep the wheels turning. And most importantly, they are the only ones with something real to lose. But for decades, this majority has been fragmented, divided, manipulated, and distracted by polarization, by consumerism, by fear, by exhaustion. Hope lies in their reconnection, in the awareness that real power was never at the top. It's always been at the bottom, and that no meaningful change comes from the top down. When workers realize this, they start asking questions. They start organizing. They start rejecting the role of expendable pawns. And when that happens, the empire trembles. Because what holds up a decaying system is not the strength of the elite. It's the obedience of the oppressed. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, that obedience is beginning to crack. Final reflection. History is repeating itself. The fall of empires is rarely recognized while it's happening. It doesn't come with fanfare or official announcements. It manifests in silences, cracks, and patterns repeating themselves. Today, we see history's old patterns resurfacing. An elite disconnected from reality. A population exhausted, divided, and buried in debt. An economic system that serves the few and punishes the many. A military power trying to compensate for lost global influence. And most of all, a collective refusal to accept that the empire is in decline. Denial is the last line of defense before collapse. And it's also the most dangerous. Because while we pretend everything is under control, we stop acting. We stop preparing. We stop building something new. The good news is that history also shows a constant truth. Every time an empire falls, space is made for something new to be born. Collapse doesn't have to be the end. It can be a new beginning. But only if we learn. Only if we acknowledge it. Only if we break the cycle. The question isn't whether the American empire is falling. It is, will you fall with it or rise with something new? If this video resonated with you, don't let it end here. Like, share, and comment below. I choose to see the truth. That simple sentence is an act of resistance. It's a reminder that you are not alone, that there are thousands, maybe millions, of people waking up to the same reality. Each view, each comment, each subscription helps break through the wall of misinformation. You can be part of change, not just by understanding the problem, but by helping spread awareness. If you want to go further, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we talk about what no one else dares to, with courage, depth, and responsibility. And now that you know what's happening, the question is, what will you do with this information? The collapse of an empire isn't just a tragedy, it's an opportunity. When old structures fall, new paths open. But only for those who are paying attention. Only for those who have the courage to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. You don't need to be a billionaire, a politician, or a general to make a difference. You need to be aware. You need to see. And from there, choose every single day not to feed the cycle of fear, lies, and exploitation. Because the system may control many things, but it can't control an awakened mind. So before you leave this video, remember, the empire may be crumbling, but you can still rise. And every real change begins with a quiet step, seeing what everyone else refuses to see.